Hello and welcome to yet another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die, featuring myself, Nate, in studio in London with no Francis, and co-producer, production assistant, friend, frequent guest, Thomas O'Mahony.
Close enough.
Fuck, I don't even know what, can I not hear it? Am I just fucking deaf? Am I the deafest podcast producer on the planet that I can never get it right?
I mean, it's not that big of a deal. It's like
Tommaso Mahuna.
Yeah, that's closer. That's
Yeah.
closer. Think Hawaiians. Maybe that's why Joe can say my name properly.
But I've also spent time in Hawaii. I don't even know, man.
Fair.
Say it the right way.
Thomas O'Mahony.
O'Mahony. Thomas O'Mahony.
I'm leaving all of this in.
Fuck! I swear to God, it kills me because like I never want to be that person who just ignores how to say someone's last name, and that used to happen all the time in the army, where it'd be like Joe. People couldn't say Kasabian, which is easy, and so they would just call him ass. Like anyone with a Polish surname or like an Eastern European surname in general that ends in any kind of ski thing just becomes ski because no one can say your name right. And I'm just like, you never want to be that asshole, and yet for some reason I cannot get an Irish name right, and it's been anglicized too. Fuck.
I mean, it's not as bad. Like, I think that the British officers have hit on the right thing by calling it, "Oh mate, Jaunty just killed loads of Arabs."
Give you a nickname then, Irish Tom. That's what we've been saying.
Irish Tom.
Fuck. Well, Irish Tom is on the show because you recently helped produce a month's worth of content on our friend podcast, Lions Led by Donkeys, in which Joe took the passenger seat, and you directed the episodes to discuss the troubles in Northern Ireland and Ireland in general. Let's be real. Something that I learned was that I guess in a way, as a kind of jumping into content, I always thought that the UVF and the UDA were confined to the occupied 6 counties. I didn't realize that they also were doing shit in the Republic of Ireland, trying to fuck things up. And so I bring the subject up because, for one, to plug the show, because I think it's a phenomenal series. Listeners should definitely check out if they haven't already. But I guess I wanted to talk to you about it because you came into the podcasting game producing a show you're still doing called Beneath the Skin, talking about history through the history of tattooing, or the history of podcasting, which I almost said would be probably a very short history.
Very
list.
meta.
But I was just interested in to just as a jumping off point, you kind of walked in with this task: research the troubles so that we don't get yelled at. Research the troubles so that we can give it a fair representation and not fuck up with all the kind of pitfalls and I call it like ideological cul-de-sacs that you wind up having, because so much of it as Americans gets filtered through the Irish American experience as well. And so I was interested in, like, just to begin, walking into this, like, how do you feel about, like, the way it's been received and, like, the kind of response you've gotten?
Yeah, like, it's been received pretty well. I'm surprised no one has, like, made a joke about my Irish NPR voice, but, like, so far, like, a lot of very, very kind things that people have said online. But the thing that I had to grapple with when I was starting this was like where to start. I made a joke on Twitter about there is a version of the script that starts in like 1200, 800 AD talking about like the Norman invasion of Ireland. But I think the reason why I started with the first episode being about the Battle of the Boyne is because I think for a lot of international audiences, they don't fundamentally understand the origins of sectarian conflicts in Northern Ireland, that they think, oh, this is just some like community thing that like popped up out of nowhere. In reality, like it's much more intergenerational, been going on for hundreds of years, and is something that is like deeply connected to like Irish history at large. And I think the thing that was hardest to do was how to tread the line in representing the history fairly, accurately, but also in a way that isn't sensationalized for a certain audience that may think, like I said at the end of the 4th episode, that they think the Troubles was about one thing or there is one side. In reality, there's multiple conflicting sides, both from people who are involved internally, who are involved directly in the conflict as paramilitaries or civilians, and the people who are like raising money to buy weapons off the Boston mob.
One of the things that I found really interesting listening to it is I'm just recalling that there is definitely a very strange mode of thought in America where you would encounter people who are pro-Republic, pro-IRA, Irish Americans who are extraordinarily politically conservative in the American context.
Mm-hmm.
They are people who would absolutely vote Republican. They are absolutely like crying because Trump lost in 2020.
They're Republicans in every sense of the word.
Exactly. But it's a very strange disconnect because there's a book, Patrick Radden Keefe's book, Say Nothing. There's a segment talking about I can't remember the name, but it was someone who worked very, very closely with the sort of political wing of the IRA. I think it was Martin McGuinness, but
probably Martin McGuinness.
And basically dealing with like a wealthy Irish American who was doing fundraising in America for the IRA, who basically, because of the amount of money he had raised, was sort of granted an audience with Martin McGuinness and basically told them, why aren't you killing the posties? Like, destroy every aspect of the British state in Northern Ireland. And Martin McGuinness is like, so do you want a gun? You want to come over and start shooting posties yourself? And basically refused this guy's money because he's like, fuck you, I don't care about you. But it was very interesting, that sort of disconnect between, like a guy who absolutely would have clubbed protesters in the fucking skull for protesting the Vietnam War, saying you guys should do Viet Cong shit on the Royal Ulster Constabulary or on the UEA or on the British Army. Like, it's a very weird disconnect, and it's like, I think there's a degree to which it is so misunderstood.
Yeah, so essentially, well, there's two things to really talk about. Is one, about the Irish diaspora, particularly in the US, have this kind of political mindset that's almost cast in amber, whether they moved during like the 1840s and 50s or earlier in the 20th century. A lot of their politics are like deeply wrapped up with conservative Catholicism rather than a holistic Irish identity that encapsulates the fact that, even in the rebellions in 1798 and in the Easter Rising and the War of Independence, there was quite a lot of Protestant communities involved in it, and their viewpoint has been warped by time in that they see both Ireland as a country and Ireland as a political identity having not changed since whenever their family got on a boat to go to the US or go to Australia or go to the UK. I encounter it quite a lot. I live in a very, very Irish community in northwest London, and like I have conversations with like guys who haven't left London since the 80s in the pub, and like they have like the same politics as the EDL, that they're like, immigrants taking our jobs while also being like Schrodinger's immigrant, also on welfare while taking jobs. And that kind of created the perfect storm as we like roll into the Troubles, that like they have this pseudo political identification with the idea of Irish republicanism rather than the actual movement. And when you look at particularly like the Republican movement in the 60s, it was a civil rights movement about housing. It was very, very small in scale and very narrow in scope, whereas Irish Americans saw this as some sort of like revolutionary battle to overthrow Britain. And you have like Eamon de Valera, former president and Taoiseach of Ireland, is one of those Irish Americans. He was the Taoiseach from 1934 until the 50s. I can't remember the exact year, but his politics were the same of like Irish American Catholicism, conservatism. So when he arrived back in Ireland, the only reason he wasn't executed in 1916 during the Easter Rising was because he was an American citizen. And obviously then that would cause a whole diplomatic incident. But like his politics can be just transported to right now, and they're the exact same. And Eamon de Valera was like completely responsible for the formation of like the authoritarian hold that the Catholic Church had in Ireland up until like still today. That like when the Irish Constitution was written, it was written with Eamon de Valera and the Archbishop of Dublin essentially creating the whole thing. And then the second thing as well is that when you have any kind of paramilitary revolutionary conflict that happens in a country, what happens is like, as always, it stems out of an original kind of grievance, in that it could be a civil rights issue, it could be a territorial issue, it could be an ethnic issue. But as you will see with like any kind of paramilitary conflict around the world, when you have like the evolution of like stochastic violence out of that original conflict, and you'll see it with the splits in the IRA, is that it's once again it's tendency infighting, which we all see.
Yeah, we know nothing about this,
but you have essentially groups that will form that believe that what they think is right. And what happened was some of the groups involved in the conflict rightfully identified groups in America who were ignorant of what was actually going on the ground and just milked them for everything they were worth. And hence why you have that guy who went to Martin McGuinness and was like, no, you need to be shooting postmen. Remember when the bin men were hard? Kill the bin men.
Yeah, I mean, you also have this disconnect where Bernadette Devlin goes to New York City and receives the key to the city from like the Fraternal Order of Irish Cops, and winds up realizing that they are reactionaries, and she winds up, she identifies with both Martin Luther King's movement and also the Black Panthers. She winds up giving the key to the city to the Black Panthers because she's disgusted by this experience she's had. And it's like, it's not that those guys in New York are not committed to the idea of, independent Ireland, of unified Ireland. It's just that they are filtering, and I think we're all guilty of this, the conflict, the experience through a sort of lens of being American first and foremost. And it's very, very strange because I think Irish American identity, there are not as many identities of sort of post-immigrant experience in America sort of absorbed into being white in America that stand out as much. I know some people, for example, where I'm from, who are German American, whose like their grandparents spoke German, and oftentimes they spoke like dialect German. They didn't even speak standard
German. Like
German.
Those communities in Argentina that just happen to speak German.
these ones are slightly different. Hilarious aside, there's
probably same politics. I'm not gonna lie.
Fair enough. Yeah, there's a Switzerland County, Indiana, and a lot of people, less so nowadays, unless they're Amish, Mennonite, but like a lot of people in those communities when it was settled spoke Bernese Swiss German. And similarly, like I had a friend from Evansville, Indiana, whose grandparents spoke German at home because but like my friend, it doesn't really see himself as German American. He doesn't go to like fucking Oktoberfest in Indiana. You know what I mean? Whereas like I have friends who are, my buddy whose surname was Patton. His dad was a cop. He joined the army. He has fucking shamrock tattoos, blackout drunk on St. Patrick's Day. Like it's a thing. Obviously fucking Roman Catholic, all these things. It seems like it sticks. It holds that clinging to that identity or sort of representing that identity through these like kind of known signifiers is such a huge deal with that community. But then, I feel like the experience that we've just been describing and that you talk about in the series is that it kind of you hit the wall of reality. You know what I mean? It's sort of like it's like someone with a Scottish American background who watches Braveheart and they're like, I'm fucking furious of the English now, but knows nothing about Scotland, has never visited Scotland. You know what I mean?
So there's, I think one thing to really like think about is the kind of foundational text about this sort of thing is how the Irish became white. Because when you look at even from like documents well into like the 1940s, is that like it wasn't really until other non-white races started migrating to the US en masse that you saw ethnic identities like the Irish, Italians, Germans start to be integrated more so into, as I suppose you could say, American institutions. You have like obviously the Kennedy political dynasty in Massachusetts, but what you had was essentially you had a institutional structure that needed more voters, more institutional bodies, and more cudgels to put down like other people who are coming into the US. So that's how you have like the Irish identity being subsumed into the American identity. And that's how you have like Irish becoming cops, Irish becoming like firefighters. You have the Italians, Greeks, Germans, kind of, and Poles as well, all splitting up different industries. And there's also kind of a natural progression of that in that Irish immigration up until like relatively recently, it was the same as emigrating from other countries, in that you arrive, someone that you know back home told you to go someplace, ask for someone, they'll get you a job, they'll get you food, and they'll get you somewhere to live. So that's how you generally start those like enclaves of like certain ethnic communities. But what happened was like Irish people very quickly realized in America, once they started to get a little bit of political and social purchase, that like they can get a leg up on everyone else if they are the oppressor. So that's when you had, the Irish becoming cops, the Irish becoming involved in local politics, and, being involved in stuff like redlining. And it was really after, the civil rights movement in the 60s that then you saw Irish stature alongside like people like Kennedy just shoot through the roof, because suddenly you have a whole underclass of people that are lower than you but legally are of the same level. So you have to have, you know, you need a new master to swing the whip. So Irish people were, after coming from a country where they had, you know, the whip cracked at themselves, they were only too happy to take up that mantle.
As a side note, I recall reading a story about red-leg people in Barbados who are sort of Irish. Many of them are descended from indentured servants who were brought to Barbados, to the West Indies, and who, you know, lived rural, very, very rural lives. And you're still relatively like unassimilated into urban culture in Barbados. And I found this article about it. It was written in sort of like a niche interest journal about sort of Irish Americans and like Irish in America or in the Americas. And it was strange because you could see, like, I don't want to read too much into it, but you could definitely see that the Irish American author was like very disappointed that these people didn't all wear clouder rings and like weren't like dancing, you know, like playing Irish reels on a fiddle. And you could tell there was a pretty profound anti-blackness in the way that she viewed them versus Barbadians, you know, and people who there is an urban middle class and upper class of black people in Barbados. These people obviously aren't of it. There is some intermarriage, but the author basically seemed very, well, A, disappointed that they weren't basically from Ireland, and B, that like the possibility existed of these people intermarrying and basically becoming black. And it's just sort of like, it's a very weird, because a long time ago I wouldn't have picked up on that dynamic, but then reading it and knowing you also, I'm like, damn.
But this is the thing, is that like Ireland has always kind of had a racism problem, in the sense of like Irish people who were either emigrated, or in particular Irish people who were prisoners and exported on prison ships to places like Barbados and Australia. They were like living in the same communities, and I think it was more so the effect of upward class mobility that outpaced the people that they were with is what helped form that mindset of, oh, you know, Irish people need to stay with Irish people, no intermixing. And like you see like fantastic influences of the mixing of cultures in places like the Caribbean and in the northeastern shores of Canada, where like Irish people emigrated. Like Newfoundland people still talk.
I wouldn't have understood Newfies that well if I didn't know you, but now when I hear them speak, I'm like, no, that's just what Tom Towns sounds like.
Like we're going through this problem in Ireland at the moment, where we have this system called direct provision, which is essentially for asylum seekers, and it's almost like a government sanctioned punishment for daring to seek asylum in Ireland. Essentially, you can't work, you can't attend education, and you're made stay in these like retrofitted hotels for up to 7 years at a time, just for the chance for asylum. And we're going through this issue at the moment where like there's a housing crisis in Ireland. There's probably going to be a jobs crisis very soon, as like you see more people get laid off because of the economy at the moment. And the far right has kind of seized on this, and they're using people's anger and directing it towards immigrants. Whereas if you look at Ireland, Ireland's always been like a very multicultural society. Maybe not necessarily like ethnically, but in terms of like, you know, Ireland has always had like lots of people from Europe living there. But what you're seeing now is that Ireland, now that the population of people from Africa, from China is growing, people from, you know, Central and Eastern Asia, and people from the Middle East, you're starting to see this new definition of Irish identity coming along, where you have kids who their parents might have moved from like Nigeria or Ghana 20 years ago. They've grown up in Ireland, spent their whole lives there, speak a kind of an Irish accent, which is this kind of new form of dialect that's forming, that's like influenced by African parents, but being surrounded by Irish kids from the north side of Dublin is like, and when you hear it, you can tell that it's there, but there's this slight, you know, flavor to it. And what's happening is these people who've like lived here for like 20 years, and like especially with, say, the Polish community is extremely integrated into Ireland as well. Like the amount of people I know that either have like Polish wives or Polish husbands, and like their kids go to school and they like have jobs just like everyone else. And now you have like this kind of undercurrent of the Irish far right, which has really been blowing up since COVID, or seizing on this like new definition of Irish identity and saying like, oh, well, Ireland's for the Irish. And it's like, well, what does it mean to be Irish? And like you've seen like when Irish people have moved abroad, that they have, constantly been redefining what the Irish identity is, like Irish communities in Barbados, commingling with native Barbadians, or like people who might be the descendants of slaves or might have been slaves themselves. There was like inter-community commingling going on, and it helped redefine what Irish identity was. Like, in Jamaica, like a common drink is Irish moss. It's this kind of like fermented milk drink. It's actually it's really nice. It's really good for a hangover. But like it's called Irish moss, and like Guinness, the third largest consumers of Guinness are Nigeria. The Irish identity is really like wherever it is. But this kind of brings it back to the problem of, the troubles in that, like, it was that inflection point of like, well, what does it mean to be Irish in a country and a community that is either actively hostile or isn't welcoming to us?
It's interesting. There was a couple things I wanted to touch on. The first one is the Irish author Colin McCann's book Transatlantic. There's a segment in the book about Frederick Douglass visiting Ireland in 1845, and there's a part where finally at some point someone uses slurs with him, and there's this. It's described as him basically being like sort of relieved that someone finally said it, because you could tell that even though people weren't saying it out loud, there was a certain hostility to this idea of this person as a free person visiting, as a a political dignitary. And it's not to say deep down Ireland is just as racist as America, but it's just more like the idea that this has been a troubled thing, this has been an issue, and that Ireland, Irish people have representation, for example, in American politics. I wouldn't go so far as, to say in British politics, because I feel like no immigrant community has representation in British politics for their community. Like people get sort of allowed to hold the levers of power so long as they toe the line. But
the Irish ambassador to the British community is Shane McGowan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's the Irish ambassador to both the British Brewers Association and the British Dental Association. I was thinking about this, but I was also thinking about you mentioned the Kennedys, and like you said, the sort of Irish political power growing. And there's a quote in, I want to say 1965, there was an Oxford Union debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, there's a quote that I'll read that I thought was really great. I thought you would appreciate this. He says, "I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard. They did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which this statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday, and now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president." And he was only a couple of years off, but it's not as if that's really massively changed things. And we started out talking about the Troubles, and I guess I want to bring it back to Northern Ireland, but I find that this is a very interesting thing, because you told me once how shocking it always is to you that you had an active war zone an hour's flight away from London, and yet you would think nobody in Britain was aware that it ever happened, with the sole exception of veterans groups who are like,
oh yeah,
no punishment for Soldier F, like, yes, we did war crimes and they were right to be done, like, we'll do them again, that kind of a thing.
Make the paras bin men.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what that Irish American guy wanted. He wanted Irish paras. He wanted the IRA to form paras to be the hardest bin men you could possibly have after they'd killed off.
You don't have to sort out your recycling; they'll do it for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you throw batteries out in your rubbish, it's fine. They'll just take them out and pelt Protestants with them,
melting down your plastic milk cartons to make Semtex.
Yeah. So like, that's a thing that you've talked to me about this before. That the sort of erasure of historical memory in this country about what was happening in Northern Ireland. And I think even at the time, the degree to which it was happening. I mean, 2 points I'll raise and I'll hand it over to you. Number one, I remember when they built, 30 St. Mary Axe, the Gherkin, the fucking Swiss rebuilding.
Yeah.
And it was opened in 2003. The site where it was built was a building that had to be demolished because it was damaged by an IRA car bomb in 1996. Now, I don't think most Americans who conceived of like almost cool Britannia era London would conceive of IRA bombs going off.
All the people blowing up buildings.
Yeah, exactly. And they all walk hand in hand through their tan lives. I don't know if I'm allowed to call them the Tans because, I mean, technically I'm here on a British passport, but you know how it is. The thing I would say, though, is the degree to which that was point number one. And point number two is I can recall this because, please correct my pronunciation if I say it wrong. Is it Omagh? Is how you say it? The
Omagh.
Omagh. The Omagh bombing in 1998, right before the signing of the Good Friday Accords. Like, I can recall being very interested and sort of affected by that because a number of the victims were children and they were either my age or younger. Now I'm 38, so they would have been 13 years old at the time. It's not that long ago, and yet you would think it never fucking happened from the perspective of let's just be honest, English people.
Yeah. So the English cultural memory is a lot like the cultural memory of any colonial power, that it is built on forgetting the past. It's essentially like, what if a country had short-term Alzheimer's?
We should cut in that segment from where Kneecap gave that interview to joe.co.uk where the guy said that ignorance is baked into your culture.
Yeah, but this is the thing, is that, like, so one, on the proximity to it, is that the Troubles were no different than any other conflict that the Brits were involved in up until the IRA started setting off bombs in the UK. Like, it was, the same as any other conflict in any other colony that they had. It was, we don't really care. Soldiers get shipped off. They can deal with it. We don't have to. And I think part of it was, once again, the kind of Murdoch media empire. There was like a media kind of push towards, like, that the conflict is inherently wrong and that there is one right side, and that is the side of the state. That what this is, this is paramilitary conflict. This has nothing to do with us. Like, none of this is our fault. We haven't done anything wrong. When you look at the reporting from, Bloody Sunday or Ballymurphy massacre or any of the shootings that happened by British soldiers, there was almost a universal line backed behind those soldiers. Like, I had to read so much about Bloody Sunday for that episode. Like, I read large portion of the Widgery inquiry transcripts. I read large parts of the Savile inquiry, which we didn't unfortunately get to talk about too much. And when you look at the fallout of incidents like that, you can see that it was a state apparatus using the media, using politicians to form a public perception of, this doesn't concern you, and the people that are involved in this conflict, they're not going to harm you, until it got to the point where there was bombs being set off in the UK, like stuff like the Birmingham 6. And to your other point, that, like, I have had so many experiences talking to British people, even British people my own age. Like, we live in an age where it's so easy to get information, and it's not like stuff like the Troubles is not talked about, but they just have, like, they've no idea, not just about the Troubles, but about Ireland in general. Like, you ask the average British person who's never been to Ireland, what do you think Ireland's like? They'll think of something like from the 60s. And funnily enough, with the Banshees of Inisherin coming out, like, so many people thought that movie was set in contemporary times, that it's not set in the 1920s. Like, we have electricity, guys. We have, internet. And I think the Kneecap are right, is ignorance is built and baked into British culture, and I know you've said it multiple times on podcasts and off podcasts, is that the entire British mindset is to never look inward and always look at the person next to you. Look at what they have, what they're doing, what they're not doing, and never actually look inwards about how you feel about things. Oh, they didn't put their bins out on time, they're a terrible person, they must be a nonce.
Yeah, the sort of a nation of pocket watchers.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think there's some things about Britain where it's weird because, like, they've managed to get by on stuff basically running on decorum and formality and inertia, and now it's kind of hitting a wall where stuff in this country is falling apart, and you're starting to see, conflicts arising about the fact that, like, if you don't have institutions that can actually handle crisis, like, it's just a permanent crisis. And I guess I look at this, that you just said that point, that now it's so much easier to get information. Whereas when the Troubles were at their peak, and, we're talking, I mean, I think it's fair to say from Bloody Sunday until the Good Friday Agreement that you basically the way people found out about it was through the news, which was especially in Britain, where it's, you know, a state-run news company. The not throwaway line in the Gang of Four lyrics about censor 6 counties news. It's like, yeah, people didn't know what was actually going on. I mean, I think that for people who have read retrospective things about it, the idea that you could be in a council estate in Belfast and, you know, a guy with an Eton accent would be broadcasting in a loudspeaker from a helicopter above you, telling to evacuate because they were going to do like a search mission, or like, you know, they were going to cordon off an area. Like, people were basically living in, I don't want to say it's the same as the occupation of Iraq, but, you know, like, there are some parallels. Like, when you have to pass through military checkpoints, and anyone in those checkpoints has the right to shoot you. Like, it's not that different in some ways. There's other ways when it's massively different. And you hear about this stuff, and it's like, there were some representations in popular culture. A lot of Americans a bit older than me would be familiar with, for example, The Crying Game, and that, like, aside from being a kind of transphobic movie, it's also a movie where, like, the sort of animating principle is the Troubles.
Yeah.
Like, it's a film about the Troubles.
Or like Patriot Games.
Exactly. Yeah. As opposed to the contemporary documentary set in the present day, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is absolutely what Ireland is like now.
Yeah.
In a way, like, The Crying Game's a love story, but then, like, if you watch this film, you might be like, oh, wait, the British military is deploying troops to...
Yeah.
I have a cousin who's only maybe about 10 years older than me, who was a veteran of the British Army, who was in Northern Ireland in the early 90s, I think. Yeah. And, like, it's nuts. Like, that was 100% a war zone. And so the degree to which it just feels as though, like, it's not remembered, it's not present, and then that then manifests even in, like, political decisions being taken in this country that could basically threaten the Good Friday Agreement. You know,
but, like, so three things. One, I know the line is trotted out quite a lot about, you know, the British state doesn't care about Northern Ireland, and to some extent they don't. But I think that is used in a way quite often that makes people think that the Republic of Ireland cares about Northern Ireland, and quite a lot of people in the Republic don't as well. They think that a united Ireland and Irish republicanism are all this great thing, but not all the kind of technical challenges that will come along with it, in the type of thing that you will hire 100 pencil pushers to sit in an office and sort out, that, like, you're not going to sort out. Politicians definitely aren't going to sort out. You need, like, 100 white shirt nerds to sit in an office and sort it out. Secondly, I think with Irish identity, particularly, like, the Irish identity of people who were born and grew up in Ireland, it is hard to define Irish identity without understanding English identity. And I say English to substitute for British, because I know Britain is quite a vast and varied country, and a lot of people identify differently. But I think when I say English identity, you kind of understand what I'm saying. And when we look at something like the Troubles, everyone talks about, say, like, the signs that said, like, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, like, that were in pubs until the 80s. You know, like, my dad was here in the 80s. My great uncle moved here in the, like, 50s when he was 14, and he still lives here. And Irish people were kind of treated no better than any other immigrant. Like, and not saying that they should have been. That's, you know, completely not what I'm saying. It's more so that, like, we were all kind of painted with the same brush, in the same way that, like, say, the popular consciousness might conceptualize, like, people from everywhere in Asia as the same type of immigrant, when in reality there's, like, vastly different cultures bringing, like, quite a lot to British culture. And, like, the curse is that, like, Irish people will always remember, British people will always forget, and that is the core of it. But on your point about, like, it being an active war zone, I think the best example for anyone who wants to learn about it is to watch Derry Girls, because that show captures perfectly, much like, you know, people who are living in Afghanistan or Iraq, you just had to get on with your regular life, and, like, you still had to go to work or go to school and meet your friends and do normal things that normal people do. But it's just this atmosphere and backdrop of conflict that's going on, and essentially what it does is it breeds in this sense of fear in your existence that, like, particularly when you're going towards the late 80s and early 90s, when there was, like, reprisal killings, random car bombs, random carjackings, that's when it starts to become pervasive, that, you know, you could leave to go to the chipper and you could die. Like, you could
Yeah.
be caught in a bomb, you could get shot. The thing that I hope people really get out of, particularly the last episode, is that, like I said earlier, when you have stochastic violence that like escalates from, you know, a movement that comes out of like civil rights or revolutionary movement, is at some point, the longer it goes on, there's no hope left, both in the movement and in the community. And that's what, and funnily enough, it's in Dairy Girls as well, is like that's what won out in the end, is that people needed hope for a better future for both them, their kids, their community, and their country. And unfortunately, unfortunately, at that point, the paramilitary movements and the groups that backed them, they had lost all hope, and it had, you know, gone down to they're trafficking heroin into the community. Now they are, you know, kneecapping people. Now they're terrorizing their own people and not the supposed quote unquote enemy. And that's what wins out in the end, is that like people needed a future to be hopeful for, or because as we're learning in Britain right now, when you have no hope for the future, everyone just tears each other apart.
Yeah, Dairy Girls is a great show. I strongly recommend it. And yeah, it's like, you know, getting held up at a British Army checkpoint while trying to get to a Take That concert when you're, you know, 16 years old. Like, the degree to which, as you were saying, like it's hard for people to imagine. And I think that you see this to some degree with the way, for example, and not to derail it, but just thinking about contemporary examples, I don't think there's any difference between a refugee from the war in Ukraine and the refugee from the war in Afghanistan, for example. These are people who've been displaced, for example, but for some reason, I mean, we know what the reason is. People seem a lot more empathetic towards refugees who look like them, who are white, who are Christian, versus people who are not. And I think one of the things that's so strange about it is that you would imagine that there would be a lot more emphasis on the fact that people who looked, talked, sounded, worshipped the same as many people in Britain, many people in America were living in this environment. And I can recall being a young, you know, a kid, almost adolescent in the mid 90s. And it's like, well, you had Cranberries lyrics, but that's basically it.
Yeah.
Like, there wasn't really much attention paid to it. It was just sort of like, oh, it's this intractable conflict, these two, you know, incredibly hostile sides. And yeah, like, it wasn't until I was an adult and I read more about it that it's like, yeah, but some of the really murderous Protestant paramilitaries were basically just auxiliaries of the British Army. They were literally folded into the command structure.
But this is, once again, like I touch on it in the last episode of the Troubled series, that like when you look at who was supplying arms to these groups and like how they were getting their funding, who like the Norwegian weapons that were stolen from an army barracks and then sold to the IRA, it's likely that the Norwegian intelligence apparatus organized that because they had no direct way to sending them arms. You had Arms Corps from South Africa trying to send a fucking Scud missile to Armagh. Like, you know, when you look at it from like the perspective of history, you can see a definite inflection point where everything just starts to spiral. That like you see like the violence, it definitely spiraled, but like politically, socially, you look at like arms flooding Northern Ireland, you look at drugs flooding Northern Ireland, you just see like the whole situation going out of control. And that's, you know, when you see like the escalation of troops being deployed, like it tore the country apart. And it's kind of shocking now that we're at the point where in 2023 you can, like, it's relatively peaceful, it's a tense peace, but you have, you know, agents like, you know, holdovers from the paramilitaries, like you have the real IRA who don't accept the Good Friday Agreement. You still have elements of the UDA who now are forgiving drug debts for teenagers if they riot with them. So like you could owe like a dealer like 80 quid for a bag of coke and suddenly you're throwing bricks at a Saracen.
To clarify for American audience, Saracen's a military vehicle. So
Yeah.
so you're basically strong-armed into becoming cannon fodder in a way.
Yeah.
I can recall this happening in British politics. Like, the most significant mention of the Troubles that I can recall in the time that I've lived in this country, which is almost 5 years now, was when it was being used to demonize Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell.
Yeah.
And I remember a really clutch kind of quote from Jeremy Corbyn when he was the leader of the Labour Party. He said, you know, when interrogated by the media about having met with Gerry Adams and I believe Martin McGuinness and members of the IRA, is that he said, in the early 80s, the British state was trying to pursue a military solution in Northern Ireland, and everyone knew that it was not going to work and that the only way forward was dialogue to try to come to a peace agreement.
But like, even saying that, like, the British government met with the IRA like 3 different times throughout the IRA and actually negotiated a ceasefire that like fell apart after a couple of days. Like the demonization of like Jerry Adams over this is like, there are like 50 different politicians. Fortunately, most of them are Tories that are like shielded from these accusations because they also met with, people like Jerry Adams, people who are involved in the Army Council of the IRA in order to negotiate peace.
Yeah.
But like, it is, I think we are far enough away from it, but not far enough that you could say something like that about a politician and like a massive section of the country will just say, oh no, he was with the Ra, he probably supports the PLO and Gaddafi.
Which is funny because if you look at British politicians who specifically have, for example, met with the PLO or other Palestinian organizations, liberation movements, and who have criticized the Israeli state for human rights abuses, most of them are Tories.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that most of them are Tories. And because like there is this weird strain of British liberalism, even if it's right-wing liberalism, that's sort of like, oh, well, I actually do think the law should be equally applied here. And it seems like a quaint notion now in the way this country is governed. But similarly, like, as you were saying, there were plenty of people who were trying to foster some kind of dialogue. And it's very strange how that's the only recollection of it I can think of.
Someone like John Hume, who literally spent his entire life, his entire political career, trying to find peace for Northern Ireland, met with everyone from every community and tried to, like, negotiate some sort of peace. But, it's that point that I said at the end of the last episode, and I did steal it from Patrick Keelty, whose father was murdered by the UDA. He said that in a great speech he did a couple of years ago, was that whether there is a united Ireland or not, there's still going to be about 1 million people who are British and about 1 million people who are Irish, regardless of what way a border poll vote goes. And that's something that, like, we have to reckon with, that, whether we like it or not, there is never going to be like, oh, as United Ireland, suddenly everyone who identifies as British, regardless of whether they're a unionist or not, because there is still quite a lot of people who identify as British but aren't unionists, are going to have some sort of involvement from the British state. But, the thing that, like, and I kind of, to come full circle, is that, like, talking about, American cops and particularly like the Irish community in the UK kind of have a very, very big problem with like far right conservatism, is that, like, to steal a line from the African American community, like, it's not a monolith, like, it's not a cultural monolith that, like, even within Ireland, like, you look at like rural versus urban communities, like, there's a huge like political, like, social political divide, like social divide, and it goes the same like across the border. Like, it's like when people say like, oh well, like, Sinn Féin in the north think one thing and Sinn Féin in the Republic say another thing. It's like, well, they're two different parties.
Yeah.
And the political system in which they operate is completely different as well.
So I'm wondering, when you, for example, encounter people, Irish Americans or people in America who are interested in this stuff, talking about kind of invoking things like Bobby Sands and the dirty protest and things along those lines, like, do you feel as though that attention being paid to the conflict winds up kind of, I don't know, becoming mythology? Or do you feel as though, like, there are people, like, you've encountered people who, like, want to know about the actual experience? Because I guess I bring this up because I have found there's plenty of Irish people that I have met in my life who are pro unification, who are pro the Republic, who I would say, or at least they are absolutely not unionists. But I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, the majority of people that I've met who are really staunch defenders of the IRA are Irish Americans. And most Irish people who are old enough to have lived through the Troubles that I know, even if they're pro-unification, even if they align politically with Sinn Féin, like, you won't see that kind of, in my experience, that kind of just default support, because a lot of them are just like, yeah, but this is a fucked up shit we lived through because of this.
Yeah, I think that is part of the issue with American socialization, is that all Americans, regardless of where their family's from, are all grasping at the ghosts of identity. They are looking for some personal signifiers that identifies them as more than American. And what I find most of the time is when you have people who are like, oh, chucking our law, or like are staunch defenders of like stuff like the IRA, or like even invoking stuff like Bobby Sands, it's like, it's never like look at this, it's look at me.
Mm.
It's look at me. I am, I'm like you. We're the same. Whereas like if you talk to any Irish person, they're like the thing that is the most annoying in Ireland is Irish Americans when they come over. Like coming over and doing like reverse land acknowledgements. They're standing on your driveway saying like, this land was owned by my great grandfather, I am claiming it. And I'm just like, it's because their version of identity is frozen in amber, but also because the US like is, particularly for white Americans, is such a culturally devoid space that they haven't built any new culture on top of the, say, Irish American identity. They haven't come up with these new definitions and new facets of Irish American identity as distinct from Ireland, in the same way that, say, Mexican Americans or people from Central America or people from Asian community, like Asian Americans, they haven't, history stopped when their family left Ireland. Whereas like you look at, say, a Vietnamese family who moved to the US in like the 80s, they continued to build what it meant to be both a Vietnamese person and American, and what it meant as part of the two. Whereas when you have white communities in the US who have European identities, they don't really care about what it means now to be Irish or to be French or to be German or even Italian. Like Italian Americans are the perfect example of this, that like they have like, okay, your grandparents arrived from Sicily. That's it. You might go to Sicily like twice in your life as like some sort of like gabagool birthright, and like, but you're changing like the language to suit your own tastes, and but you're still holding on to this weird bastardized form of what it means to be Italian. Whereas like it's the same with Irish Americans. Irish people don't eat corned beef and cabbage.
I mean, I would say that. So a couple of things. First, I'll say, I think that this is true of a lot of white communities in America, even the ones that we wouldn't think. I mean, my perception now, having lived here, is that sort of New England WASP Americans are doing the same trapped in amber experience of upper middle class and upper class English people in America. And I recognize that like a lot of those kind of signifiers are not, that's not how British people are, English people are. It's a specific class, and they're kind of exaggerating what their ancestors were like when they emigrated. Mm-hmm. I would say, I'd push back on two things. One, I'd say, I think that from my experience with friends who are Asian American, I think there is definitely like kind of an authenticity and sort of like cultural memory argument being had, because like being from America is going to make you different. Yeah. And I a lot of people that I know, even if, for example, I have one close friend who his parents moved back to Korea when they retired, and so he goes back, but like he's not really a big fan of spending time there, because even though he speaks Korean, like he's culturally American. Yeah. And so like he's having spent more time with his parents recently, like he obviously speaks Korean way better now because he has to, but it's one of those things where it's like he's always going to feel foreign. And I feel the same way being here, that like I've never felt so American living outside of America and I might realistically not ever move back to America, but like I recognize that it's not like I've just gotten subsumed into being British, for example.
But that being said, like you said, your friend who is Korean American, he's still building his own identity as a Korean American. It's not like he is like saying like, I'm still Korean. I'm going to act the way that my parents acted in 1980 when they immigrated to America. I'm going to do literally everything. Like every time people come over to my house, we're going to play laser discs and we're going to fucking do karaoke. No, I mean, but I would say another thing I push back on is that I think that white Americans do actually have, like, we have a culture. As Americans, we have a culture. It's just that there's this kind of shooting minorities.
Well, there's that, but I think that it's more like we also have a kind of weird cultural cringe that wants to kind of valorize and privilege old world things as if to say, oh, that's what a real culture is like. But I mean, let's be honest, like the things that we have, if we can just acknowledge that, like, that this is a kind of a collective property for some of the things that we celebrate, like the holidays we celebrate, the ways we celebrate, like the foods we cook, things like that, and not be like, this is this, not pretend, for example, that like some of our best foods weren't created by Black people, or, like things along those lines. If you can kind of think of it as like a thing that is collectively American, like we do actually have a lot of cultural things. And like you discover that when you live outside the US for a while, that like, actually, we've got a lot of things that you just don't do in other countries. It's just that I do think that there is this weird kind of like cherry on top sort of I'm specialness of being someone who's, 4th, 5th, 6th generation Irish American, but then still clings to the old country. And it's like,
but the thing is that like and I think this will be maybe the final point I'll say, is that I don't think staying connected to a historical familial connection to a country is inherently wrong. It's if you are still like, say, up to date with contemporary culture and contemporary politics, and not to be like a weeb about being in Ireland. That's, you know, don't be like the cop who comes with his like wife and 2.5 children and like rocks up to me in a bar and saying like, top of the morning, can you put a shamrock in my Guinness? I'm going to tell you to fuck off. But like, it is, and you know, I'm kind of facing that myself, you know, being someone who has moved away from Ireland, is disconnected from Irish culture at home. I still have to, I know I'm only like an hour's flight away, but I still need to, you know, try and stay up to date with like what's going on. And that is the thing that is the issue with not just like Irish Americans, it's Irish people after one or two generations like moving anywhere. Either they become the like evangelical like cop paddy, or they become like the, oh, you know, wolf tone pictures in my house paddy. It's like there is contemporary problems and contemporary, you know, culture and like really great things being done in Ireland by people that quite often these people wouldn't maybe consider Irish, because, you know, they're, you know, first generation immigrants in Ireland. And this is the thing, is that Irish people on the whole are like very welcoming and very like happy to, you know, welcome people into their homes and their cultural houses. And like there's wonderful things being going on, but like they just want to talk about like the 5 Dubliner songs they know and like how Guinness is great, despite the fact it was, you know, created by a person who was massively opposed to home rule.
Yeah. You can go back and do Birthright and see the, you know, 2 Up, 2 Down that your great-grandfather lived in Dublin, and it's now being rented for 10,000 euros a month by someone who works for Dropbox.
Yeah, the 2 Up, 2 Down, like absolute shithole tenement where your grandfather probably had TB in and like thought like in the 1930s, like, this is shit, I cannot wait to get to Boston.
Exactly, I cannot wait to get the fuck out of here. And that's another thing that's really funny too. I have to say this as a final point. Like, I think one of the things that I'm always pushing back on is that, like, I really wish that there would be some perspective, because, for example, I don't find this to be a thing in my experience with Irish people, but certainly with Irish Americans being like really, really hardcore on Trump shit and, you know, being anti-immigrant, which is obviously a very stupid and funny thing considering.
Oh, a lot of Irish people love that stuff as well.
But the thing I would say is that, like, one of the biggest undocumented immigrant communities in America
is
Irish people who have overstayed their visas and just live in America without papers. Like, that's 100% a thing. And so I guess as we close out on this episode, I would say to anyone out there, I'll link in the show notes to the episodes about the Troubles that Tom put together with Joe. I really, really hope that you'll take a minute and listen to take a couple hours, because it's a 4-part series. And I guess I wanted to maybe pass it over to you for the end here. Like, is there anything that either that you wish people would read, watch, etc., or something you've encountered during doing research for this that you would want people to know about?
I would recommend looking at, you know, eyewitness reports from the Troubles. Like, see what the actual people who were living their lives and were affected by it, regardless of whatever community they were in, how they were affected by it, because that's really the most important thing to remember, is that there are hundreds of thousands of people whose lives were irrevocably changed through either injury, trauma, generational trauma, who are still affected by this today. And look at, you know, the legacy of the British government, not just in terms of the Troubles, but in terms of like the economic makeup of Northern Ireland, and also like listen to some current Irish music. Like, I don't want to go to a pub and hear the same 5 Pogues and Dubliner songs over and over again. Like, please listen to stuff like Lankum, listen to stuff like Kneecap, and like listen to like all these fantastic music being made by first generation like Black Irish, you know, kids who are like in their early 20s, who like their parents moved over to give them a better life the same way your family did like 3 generations ago.
Yeah, and also the Plastic Patty music, I've got to say, that also includes Stiff Little Fingers, who were great. They're great, but like,
greatest punk band ever.
But Stiff Little Fingers is talking about growing up in Northern Ireland in the 70s. Like, that's 50 years ago.
Yeah,
stuff has changed, and it's one of those things where I feel like we encounter it I'm sure English people deal with it, with people coming over and having like Paris syndrome, where they're like, why is London not like a Harry Potter movie? I don't fucking know. But I really do think that there's a specific demographic, and I just feel like I'm glad we had a chance to let you kind of take the reins on the show and talk about it. I really, really hope anyone listening to this takes some time and goes and listens to that whole series. And also, you should plug your other show.
Oh yeah, I also host a show that Nate mentioned at the start, called Beneath the Skin. It is the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. So if you're interested in tattoos, definitely listen to it. But it's also like a great history show for talking about the weird influence of like politics, sex, sociology, anthropology in like tattooing. And particularly we talk quite a lot about, you know, the effects of colonialism in the world and like its effect on tattooing, but also on culture. And yeah, it's a good time. You can find us on all good streaming platforms.
And also on the 33rd County, which is bonus content that you guys are going to spin out eventually to be
eventually.
Yeah, but presently bonus content on the What a Hell of a Way to Die Patreon. You can hear Tom and Shocks talk about the disjuncts between Irish and Irish American culture, because you don't really want to hear it from me all the time, being extremely, despite having red hair, not being Irish in any way whatsoever.
Fucking Huguenot.
I know, man. There's really, really funny is that I actually thought I might have one Irish ancestor, and then when I did ancestry.co.uk and looked it up, it was that her parents were English. Her father was an English army officer and a British army officer stationed in Ireland before home rule was granted. So,
of course,
not only am I not Irish in any way, but my one connection to Ireland is through military occupation, and I've somehow managed to keep that going. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak to you next week.